A 4-ton piece of SpaceX rocket is believed to have unintentionally crashed into the moon. The collision by the Falcon 9 upper stage posed no danger to Earth, but is expected to leave behind a lunar crater. Scientists and amateur stargazers alike had been looking forward to observing the sunlit plume of rubble and debris created by the smash. Well, for more on this story, we can bring in Dr. Jonathan McDowell, member of the Center for Space Environmentalism and honorary professor at Durham University. Thank you very much for joining us on France 24. First of all, how and why did these sorts of lunar collisions happen?
Well, the problem is that it wasn't meant to hit the moon. They just left it there. They sent this rocket was launched in January 2025 to send 2 moon landers on the way to the moon, and they just left it in orbit, swanning around under gravity. And the problem is that in this particular kind of orbit, the moon tugs on it every month a little bit, and it's very hard to predict where it ends up. Unfortunately, the moon gave the wrong tug. It ended up crashing into the moon. And so that's a bit messy. It's not a huge deal at the moment, but we really don't want this kind of thing to be happening once we have lots of astronauts and scientific experiments on the moon.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? I mean, what are the potential dangers that these crashes can create?
Well, so you have, 4 tons of metal smashing into the moon at thousands of miles an hour. And the moon, if you have a car crash on Earth, right, a plane crash on Earth, the debris doesn't go very far because the atmosphere stops it. On the moon, there's no atmosphere, there's less gravity. And so pieces of stuff that the crash kicks up can go for hundreds of miles. And so if you've got a delicate scientific experiment like a telescope or like a gravitational wave detector that's looking for tiny seismic events, then that's going to mess you up. And of course, obviously, there's the small but not zero risk that it lands where there are astronauts, and that would be very bad. So I think we really have to do a better job of keeping track of where our space junk is and of disposing of it in a more responsible manner.
We'll get more to the space junk in just a moment, but for this particular collision, why are scientists keen to see this debris come from this crash? What can they learn from this collision in particular?
Well, there's trillions of craters on the moon, right? What's another one? Well, it's one that's made by something where we know exactly what it's made of and how much it weighed. And so that lets us calibrate it, lets us figure out how craters are made. It lets us understand then how the other craters were made. And so scientifically, that's pretty interesting. We also want to see how far the debris goes and see if our models are right about that, so that we can set proper regulations for, where can you crash something on the moon, or should you be allowed to at all? And what precautions should you take if you're on the surface, if you think there is going to be a crash? So that all of that is going to be really interesting to study once we find the crater, which we should do in a while when, within a couple of weeks, when the lunar orbiting mapping spacecraft take pictures of the site.
All right, and we hear about these thousands of pieces of space junk that's kind of just floating around out there. What does this mean for satellites, for example, who have to dodge that?
Right. So in Earth orbit, much closer to the Earth than this, yeah, we're tracking 30,000 pieces of junk. There are tens of thousands of avoidance maneuvers, dodging going on every year, and it's really untenable in the long term. So I think we have to have an international space traffic control agency. We have to have rules of the road that just don't exist right now. It's incredible to hear that, but they don't. And so, clearing up space, making it sustainable might not seem that important to those of us who spend our lives on Earth and don't really think about space very much. But, you like to have your GPS, and you like to have sort of banking transactions that send data over satellites and streaming over satellites and so on. So our 21st century is really dependent on space, and we have to be a bit more careful about not messing it up.
Exactly. I mean, this is a moment when space and lunar exploration is becoming more common, not only with US private companies like SpaceX, but also developing countries like India landing on the moon. how and at what point can players come together and make some of these regulations, as you say?
Right. Even if we can't get regulations, we should at least have norms. We should have agreements, even if informal, about what's the right thing to do. How, what side of the road should you drive on? What should you do with your junk? There's an organization called the Open Lunar Foundation, which is setting up a repository where space agencies can exchange information without having to sort of commit to some kind of agreement. And I hope that that kind of idea takes off so that we can coordinate the very many different organizations, like you say, developing countries, commercial companies, and so on, that are making our lunar future look very complicated right now.
Certainly fascinating, and as you say, not necessarily the first thing that we think about here on Earth. Dr. Jonathan McDowell, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.